Operation Sunken Sea is a large-scale infrastructural intervention. Welcome to my bunker. I'm really thrilled about this installation of this project as such, and I think this kind of basement underground space really provided kind of a nice atmosphere for it. Here on the pedestal, on this monster pedestal that you see, I've presented historical material, all of it which is real. And these are the various proposals of draining the Mediterranean Sea. And as you can see here, I had told you earlier that I'm restaging a lot of these historical documents and historical photographs in an attempt to overtake the narrative. So here's one example of a photograph by a German engineer, Hermann Zergel, from 1920, a portrait I believe Time magazine did. And so I restaged that portrait, and now when you look up Hermann Zergel, this particular image is the one that comes up with the search algorithm on the internet. I'm also mining a lot of content on Twitter. I'm interested in seeing what are the contemporary mottos that are being used, especially in relation to right-wing and fascist ideologies, only to discover that a lot of the rhetoric is still the same today as it was, 50, 70, maybe even 100 years ago. This here is a declassified CIA document that was just declassified 2 years ago, in fact, just in time for my project. And so this is the actual file that I discovered about their proposal to flood the Sahara Sea and change the climate. And the language to me is really astounding, and even in their document, they propose it as a spectacular and peaceful proposal. Also important to note is that they propose it as a solution for Palestinian Arabs, in that it would provide work during construction and living areas after completion. And so the idea was to move all the Palestinian Arabs to North Africa, and particularly Egypt. This here is a really important part of the project, and you'll see it's a logo that I use in the flags. There's a big flag outside of Mosaic Rooms, but the backdrop of my live speech. This is a 10th century map of the Mediterranean. And I was really fascinated by the way in which it's visualized. With the sea as this kind of dominant central space. At this time, under the Islamic Empire, the Mediterranean was the center of the world, and so everything is then constructed around it. And of course, that's very different from today, when we consider the Mediterranean as a sort of barrier or a border between Africa and Europe that keeps Africans from migrating into Europe. And so I think what's really interesting about these projects is, in fact, this idea has not been put to rest even today. And in fact, in the context of a sort of water crisis that's happening in East Africa, starting with Ethiopia building the Renaissance Dam and the impact that it might have on Sudan and Egypt. Egypt is looking at kind of other ways to access underground water, but maybe also perhaps funneling the Mediterranean into a giant sinkhole in northern Egypt called the Attara Depression. So these wallpaper images are photographs that I'm researching and working with from an archive at the US Library of Congress called the Matson Collection. And so I'm really interested in looking at the ways in which photography and the technologies of photography are being used to justify certain kind of violent interventions in these geographies, but the ways in which that violence is then embedded in the technology itself. Can we now look at aerial photographs of the region and not address this kind of initial visualization of that landscape in this kind of, from this perspective? So what I love about how this work is displayed in this exhibition is that there's a very nice juxtaposition here with these contemporary landscapes of storks that are migrating from Israel into Europe, and they're flying over contested territories, and then they're juxtaposed with these early 20th century aerial photographs of the same landscapes that were then used to kind of justify a lot of these settlements. And so I think there's a really nice conversation here about, how do we use photography and imagery as sort of evidence, either to discuss, either to push forward certain ideologies or to kind of use as evidence for human rights cases. But in fact, here they really kind of juxtaposed against each other. They really relay this interesting narrative that forces us to question how these landscapes are visualized. I really use Lord Allenby and his relationship with this peculiar stork. It is highlighted in a few of these images, but there's also a video over here, and kind of one of the first historical documents I came across that really highlights this peculiar relationship between Allenby and this pet marabou stork that he had in his villa in Cairo. And so I found this connection really quite beautiful between Lord Allenby and his stork and the spy stork that was caught in 2013 as kind of brackets to then discuss the entire visual depiction of this region in the last 100 years through the perspective of this bird's eye view. Do we go from here? Yeah. This project is always really difficult for me to watch. I often install it and then never look at it again because it's still very emotional. This is the first time that I display it this way. The project really, I would say, started about 20 years ago when I started filming these architectural spaces in Cairo, abandoned buildings, failed architectural investment projects, buildings that were being built and never finished. And I was using them as a metaphor to talk about government corruption because at that time you really couldn't overtly talk about things like that. The uprising started in early 2011 and this platform Speak to Tweet emerged and these voice messages were recorded. It suddenly made a whole lot of sense for me to juxtapose them with the footage that I had filmed. And it was one of those moments that you always wish for as an artist where things just suddenly make sense without you trying. And I had this one edited film with no audio and I put a voice message to it and it was the exact length. And it just revealed something even so emotive and so meaningful, and it captured exactly what it was that I was trying to capture with the footage. And I have a big archive of films. This is only a select few of them, but the idea is that every time I exhibit it, it grows larger and it becomes this kind of hallucination of the psyche of a city. As you can see, we've used this kind of architectural elements of construction to build the installation. It also very eerily resembles a sort of jail cell that I think makes the piece quite, at least for me, quite difficult to kind of sit in it. But I hope, I think that this piece is quite moving even for those who maybe did not have that personal connection, because you see these very raw emotions of people being expressed, or you hear them. This video, for example, is quite an emotional recording from a guy who calls in to recite a poem that he wrote while he was in prison, and states that he was one of the youngest ideological prisoners and resided in 10 different prison camps. And so this is he felt the need to kind of recite this poem at this time, and it's kind of full of pain and emotion and hope. And so again, there's something very raw about these voice messages. This is also a very difficult message, very short message by a guy who calls in to say that he's going out to the square to protest and he doesn't know what will happen to him. At that point, there was quite a bit of violence at the protests, and so he basically calls in to say that in the case that something happens to him, he wants to be remembered. And so here he is recording this message, knowing that his voice being recorded will live beyond his own existence. So what I'm trying to do is in a way honor that and really make sure that this archive remains and is preserved and is made public again. This is a voice message that I was really struck by when a woman called in and basically poses this set of questions of, what if things were different? What if this previous regime of Mubarak had been different and they had really kind of emphasized the well-being of their people? How would things have been different? And so I like this kind of posing of questions that she's putting forward. But there's also something very sad about it because we all hoped to imagine this kind of alternative reality that never came to fruition. And now I need to get out of here. This project really, I can't listen to this project. This flag seems to always be tangled.